All right, so another question that's come up in the forum has been about the use of antibiotics and vaccines in agriculture. And I think that's a visceral question for a lot of people because it affects our food system and the things that we're putting into our bodies. Nonetheless, we effectively experiment or test out lots of different strategies for using antibiotics and vaccines in agricultural systems for controlling complex disease processes. And I'm wondering, to what extent can we learn from the experience of these replicated examples of using drugs and vaccines in agricultural systems to help us understand about strategies that might be more effective in human health, or in fact lessons learned and concerns that we might have for the application of some of these strategies in human health?
Well, my view is that agriculture's got a lot to teach medicine and public health. Partly because often in agriculture these things are used in a more liberal way in a variety of different practices, and partly because the sorts of things one can try typically don't have the same sort of oversight and controls. Going back to what Matt said earlier in the question about how we've looked at things like DDT in the past, I mean, you can throw these apparent magic bullets around like crazy in agriculture, and the lesson has been that they don't work in the long term. They're not sustainable solutions. I think from the point of view of the drug use in farms, antibiotic use in farms as growth promoters, there are lots of interesting issues that we can learn there. One of them, to me, is why are they still working? Mm-hmm. In hospitals, if we throw antibiotics on like crazy, they stop working really fast. Yeah? Resistance happens really quick. What is it about the use of antibiotics as growth promoters that apparently mean it continues to work after many decades? That, to me, is a very, very interesting question. Mm-hmm. What makes growth promoting use of antibiotics evolution proof, whereas it's not when you use it for direct health? So that's one issue.
So you don't know the answer? But
I don't know the answer. I've got a few theories on that, but I don't know the answer. Well, one of them is they might not be working, mm-hmm. and so that resistance may have evolved, and in fact it's just one of those things people do add in promoters, antibiotics, and so it's not working. Another one is it's something to do with the dosing. The way in which it's used in a farm context is different. Typically lower dose, and that might select for resistance at a slower, more gentle rate. If that speculation is correct, which runs in the face of fairly large amounts of dogma in medicine, that would be very important to understand.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
And so this is a question that's come up from both sides in the forum, in fact, that we had some people that were asking, well, is it possible just to use higher doses of these drugs rather than having to continue to develop new ones? Can we just increase the strength? Whereas others have asked the question, can we be using lower doses so that we create a less stringent selective environment, right? Because if you kill all 99%, then the remaining 1% are bound to be the ones that are resistant.
So I think the first thing to say on that question of what's the best way of the best dosing regimen is that this is an active area of ongoing scientific debate and controversy. We don't know the answer to this. So the things you've mentioned there, both extremes, are logically sensible, and how they play out in different contexts is going to vary. So this is an ongoing debate. I have to say I'm very tied up in this debate in my own research. To me, in the hospital context, the issue, if you can crank the dose up high enough to kill everything so that no resistant semi-mutants, no resistant mutants can appear, you should do that. But that's not the interesting case. The interesting case is where you can't do that because either the drug is too expensive or the side effects, toxicity and so forth. I mean, you can't keep cranking the dose up. And under those situations where there's an upper bound, then you have to ask whether fighting fire with fire is the really best way of going. If you're trying to control resistance by killing things and imposing more selection, it's a very counterintuitive thing, and you've got to be doing it, understanding the scenario well. My default position, I think this comes from agriculture as well, is that in general you want to decrease the use of your magic bullets as much as possible. So we know from agriculture, targeted use of pesticides at particular parts of the life cycle of the insect, only using them when you really need to do it, leaving aside areas where you're not applying technologies, rest areas, weakening selection is what you want to do. And I think and that's true in medicine, I think. And that's why, for example, antibiotics are only available on prescription. We're trying to limit the use of them to where it's necessary. We need to keep pushing down that use. And the question becomes, in treatment of an individual patient who has a pathogen, how much drug do we really need to control that? And for me, often the question is going to be, well, you want to knock the edge off the symptoms, make the patient healthier, and then let their immune system clear everything else out. Don't try not to get the drug to do everything. The drug should do just what's necessary.
So is it the case, you mentioned
antibiotics only being available on prescription motivated by resistance. Is that what that was in the forebrain of people that made that decision?
I believe that the use of prescriptions access to antibiotics is the largest single experiment humans have ever done in trying to manipulate evolution.
Oh.
So the ambition is to, deliberately I should say, the ambition has been to set out to restrict the use of antibiotics to those situations needed on the assumption that that will help manage resistance to those drugs in future. And in places which don't do that, for instance in India and China, places where you can buy antibiotics over the counter, there are rampant antibiotic resistance issues. So that is a global attempt to manage the evolution of a species. I think the biggest humans have ever tried.
But the public challenges, I think, probably can't be understated there. So even in the US, there's one of the two largest groups that are getting antibiotics are kids and older adults. And there's great research that part of what's happening with the kids is that in order for your children to go to daycare, if they have symptoms, you need to come back with an antibiotic. And so there's this policy issue that is all of a sudden creating this big demand on parents to go and get an antibiotic so the kids can go back into care. And that's not one of the times I know you think it's needed for, right? Because it's likely to be a virus, it's likely to be something else. But it goes back to the questions that were asked much earlier, which is how, if there's another refrain from this course, it's how we live in our ecology. We live with our microbiome, we live with the rest of the system. How are we going to live with having strep? How are we going to live with having pneumonia? How are we going to live with having TB? And are we going to have some cases where we allow it to happen? We're going to treat it when it's at a certain level. How are we going to live with not having a system where it's going to be no disease ever?
Yeah, right? I think the way I see it going is that we would like to have a sterile world where we don't have cancer in our bodies, where we don't have any pathogens in our bodies. But we can't do that. Right. And if we can't do that, how do we go about living with these things to maximize lifespan and well-being?
And it does sound like even if we were to achieve it, we may have a whole lot more costs.
Yeah, right.
If we did eradicate our entire microbiome.
We certainly don't want to get rid of the entire microbiome, but it would be great to get rid of some pathogens.
Yeah.
But we sure have to be asking, if we're going to do these with chemical solutions and they aren't sustainable, what are we going to do then?